Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to start off by thanking the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for hosting this conference, and for Elizabeta for being a chair for our panel. My topic for today is an outcome of my research on the historic preservation of the old city of Damascus, where I explore the social impact of gentrification and urban revitalization on local communities. The Old City is one of the most diverse districts in Damascus, and along with representation of the main sects and ethnic groups that compose the Syrian nation, there is a significant number of Palestinian refugees that have been living in the intramural neighborhoods since 1947. Palestinians in Syria amount for about 2% of the population, but in the Old City, it's between 8 and 10%. Nonetheless, Palestinians have a marked presence in the Old City, especially in Hayy al-Amin, or Hayy al-Yahud, the Jewish neighborhood, where most of the Palestinians registered as refugees live, and where there is UNRWA, run school and a clinic distinguished by their cobalt blue signs, doors, and windows. That's a sure sign that you have Palestinian presence when you have the UNRWA sign. Based on ethnographic fieldwork, I will demonstrate how Palestinians in the Old City are able to integrate within the local community but maintain their distinction as refugees and Palestinians. I use the term integrate with caution since there are legislative measures that prevent full incorporation of Palestinians within Syria, and I'll go into those later. My emphasis is on how the label refugee becomes more significant as a trope of Palestinianness in Syria, especially after 1982, when the PLO left Lebanon and Israel invaded the country. Lebanon, not Syria. This led to a redefinition of what it meant to be a Palestinian refugee, and I'm connecting it with Nidal, which means struggle. Before 1982, being a Palestinian refugee was distinguished by military and political Nidal. But after 1982, it shifted more to social Nidal. So I'm using the term Nidal to define Palestinian refugees in Syria. Palestinians who live in the neighborhood are still able to inscribe refuginess by recreating in the historic quarter the spatial practices of being in a camp. Through these practices, the community is able to strengthen solidarity among its members and reinforce their sense of Palestinianness in a predominantly local effort after political Palestinian organizations shrank and the future of refugees assumes more uncertainty. Moreover, Palestinian refugees in the Old City are able to do this without isolating themselves from other groups and communities, but negotiate the delicate balance between integration and separation in the host city. Palestinians seem to prefer this liminal phase of existence since it preserves their identity and keeps them connected to the larger Palestinian diaspora. Since any identity is constantly being negotiated, here we see an example from the experience of Palestinians where the local conditions in the Old City allow them to re-articulate an identity that addresses the situation in the Old City while maintaining the underlying Palestinianness of their identity. This contributes to our understanding of how a group that continues to be culturally displaced reproduces a national identity in a diaspora, not only by looking back to a homeland and nation and through the retelling of the past, but through the daily experiences, negotiating life, and that are deployed to reinforce a deterritorialized national identity. To quote Stuart Hall, the diaspora experience is defined not by essence or purity, but by recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference. I will begin with a brief overview of Palestinians in Syria before I describe the community that resides in the Old City. I will then describe how Palestinians in the Old City are redefining their status after 1982, and I will do that by focusing on a community center that was opened in the early 1990s to meet the demands of the local community, both in economic and social terms. And I will conclude with how Palestinians are able to deal with the bureaucratic and legal restrictions placed upon them by UNRWA in the host country and remain refugees. Approximately 100,000 Palestinians, mainly from Haifa, Safad, and Tiberias and their surrounding villages, found their way to Syria between the years 1947 and 1949. Many found shelter in the Old City, in Hayy al-Amin, and in the fields lying beyond the city walls. Palestinians were housed in mosques and schools, as well as tents pitched in fields, before many of them were moved to refugee camps that were open throughout the country. According to UNRWA, there are approximately 472,000 registered Palestinian refugees in Syria today, living in 9 official and 3 unofficial camps throughout the country. Several families remained in the Old City, and according to the director of the center that I'm going to talk about, there are now between 600 and 700 families living there. I call the Palestinian refugees in the Old City town refugees, borrowing the term from Lisa Malki, although urban refugees has also been used earlier today. In the Old City, you have the closely built courtyard houses that house several families and are found along narrow, winding alleys. A lot of these houses that the Palestinians live in belong to the Jews that used to live in Syria but fled during 1948. And there's a distinction between this community that fled in 1948 because a large number of Jews remained in Damascus until 1992-93, where they left as well. Now, the Palestinians only live in houses that belong to the community that left in 1948. The houses are considered absentee property, and they're leased to Palestinians who lost their homes in Palestine in sort of an exchange. The Palestinians live in homes of Jews, whereas Jews live in the homes of Palestinians, the ones who left for Israel proper. The houses tend to be located along certain axes in Hayy al-Amin, and they're concentrated in a specific area. So with the physical structure of the Old City, with the houses that the Palestinians live in, you do have a space that approximates a refugee camp. And many Palestinians that I interviewed in the Old City described living in the Old City as shibh mukhayyam, or a semi-camp. However, the official UNRWA website makes no mention of its center and school in the historic Old City, nor that it has a significant number of refugees in the Old City. I did encounter some hesitation from the UNRWA staff concerning my interest in the center. The location of UNRWA in the Old City is a delicate matter, and though no one actually stated, I did sense that UNRWA was expected to keep a muted presence in Damascus. Damascus, one of the old, historic cities in the world, does not want the stigma of being considered a refugee camp. Several scholars have noted how the refugee camp is a device of power for the spatial concentration and ordering of people that it enabled, as well as the administrative and bureaucratic processes it facilitated within its borders. Living in a refugee camp also marks residents as displaced and out of place. But for refugees living in camps, it becomes a marker of an uncontested identity and is appropriated by the refugees themselves to signal difference. And this is kind of the same attitude that Palestinians born and raised in Hayy al-Amin describe their environment. For example, Samia, who was born in Hayy al-Amin and is one of the active members of the community, and I've gotten to know her over several years, described the neighborhood as shibh mukhayyam. And in her words, she says, "It is not a camp as a camp, but they, meaning the Syrians, think that Palestinians maintain their traditions and values if they live in a camp. The preservation of these values, traditions, and identity is from the Palestinian family, from the way of upbringing. Palestinians preserve their patrimony through their families regardless of where they live." So here, for Samia, being a Palestinian has nothing to do with where you live, but in the family that you grow up in. And according to her, no matter where you live in Syria, you remain a Palestinian because you grow up in a Palestinian family. Widad, who is another woman I interviewed, said that she always felt as a Palestinian because the school she went to UNRWA school. She had teachers who were Palestinian. You only go to an UNRWA school if you are a Palestinian. Her friends are all Palestinian, so of course she is a Palestinian. And she thought that living in the old city was different from a camp because it was more arqa, or upscale, than living in a mukhayyam. Ironically, she was referring to Al Yarmouk, which is called a camp, but it actually isn't. It's one of the flourishing suburbs of Damascus, where in addition to Palestinians, you have a lot of other groups from Syria and either Iraqi refugees who now live in Yarmouk. Hence, for Wadad, she felt that a more Palestinian environment existed in the old city. And I pressed the people that I talked to, what is it about living in the old city that makes it a Palestinian community? And Samia again says that it is true that we are influenced by the city and the people who live in the city, but we did not adopt city ways. We never forgot that we are Palestinians. We took from Syrian society, but we did not assimilate, or in her words, ma dubna, we did not melt. And this becomes a very important point that she repeats over and over again in her conversations with me, ma dubna, we did not melt, we did not assimilate, we did not become Syrians. And part of the reason of remaining Palestinian was that we know our problems. We support one another. We visit one another if someone dies. If there is a wedding, everyone goes, even if they are not invited. Those who leave, they come back and support and help their neighbors. They know the families that are in need. And it has happened time and time again. Doctors, engineers from this neighborhood left. They came back and they made contributions to families that were in need. They went to Germany, they went to the US, Sweden. They came back and visited the neighborhoods and their friends. This is what I mean by we did not melt. We did not say we are Shwam. So from her description, from her analysis, she believes that remaining Palestinian had a lot to do with the solidarity and the sociability that existed among these families that remained in the old city. It's true that what she talks about is the same for any community that remains in Hayy al-Amin, for the Jews who remained in Hayy al-Amin, for the Armenians who live there. But for her, being a Palestinian in the old city takes on added significance because it is not labeled as a camp and it's not defined as a refugee camp. The other thing is that the shared experience as refugees enhances the bond of Palestinians who live in the old city. It's possible to maintain the worldview of a refugee even though one is not living in a camp. Although Palestinians, not all of Palestinians are refugees, the trauma of a Nakba reinforced the experience of what it meant to be a Palestinian, that of a dispersed population and displaced people. Although there's a stigma attached to being a refugee, any refugee, for Palestinians, especially for those in the old city, it becomes, in the words of Stuart Hall again, a shared cultural code that provides stable, unchanging, and continuous frames of reference and meaning beneath the shifting divisions of actual history. For Palestinians in the old city, the assertion of being refugees take on great importance because they live in an urban environment among other Syrian groups, but also because as town refugees, they have to work harder at making this distinction from other community members in the urban neighborhoods. When Samia insists we did not become neighborhood, it is true that they did deal with Syrian society, but they kept their Palestinian character, they kept a Palestinian environment to the very little detail of brewing their tea with maramiya, sage, instead of mint like the Syrians. And actually when I would go to the center and meet with them, they would tell me, do you want Palestinian tea or do you want Syrian tea? But another fact that kept Palestinianness among the residents of the old city was Nidal, or struggle. And this becomes one of the main markers that differentiates Palestinians from other Syrians. Again, I'm quoting from Samia. There is a group from the neighborhood that worked in Palestinian organizations, tanzimat, and they were able to incorporate many of the young people in the neighborhood. They were able to organize them. Now, if one member of the family got organized, the impact was felt throughout the entire family. Other people I interviewed insisted that Nidal, political and military Nidal, started in Hayy al-Amin. It's interesting because this form of Nidal, the political and military aspect of it, is local in that you're recruiting young men and young women from the local community, but you're addressing the wider Palestinian cause. You're acting to further the cause for all Palestinians, regardless where they live. Okay, now the other thing about living in Syria is that the Palestinians are really proud of maintaining their distinction as a separate group. However, there are also legislative measures put in forth by the Syrian government that allowed Palestinian conditional integration into the Syrian nation. One of the important laws was 260 of 1956, and here I quote, "Palestinians reside in Syria as of the date of the publication of this law are to be considered as originally Syrian in all things covered by the law and legally valid regulations considering the right to employment, commerce, national service while preserving their original nationality." And preserving their original nationality becomes the linchpin for determining what Palestinians can and cannot do in Syria. For the most part, they are entitled to employment, to education. They can go to Syrian universities. They're issued passports that are labeled Palestinian. They can travel if they can get a visa or if any country would allow them entry. However, they're not allowed to run in elections or to vote in presidential elections or any kind of parliamentary elections. And according to one Palestinian, this is not a big deal because in Syria you do not really have real elections. Now, in the 1990s, the impacts of 1982 was beginning to be felt throughout the Old City. The political and military activism of many of the young men and women of the neighborhood began to decrease. Many who were in Lebanon came home. The future was not looking very bright for many of these young Palestinians. In the aftermath of 1982, a lot of Scandinavian countries opened immigration, allowed immigration. So many of these families left to Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden. In addition, the economic conditions in the Old City were beginning to deteriorate. In the early 1990s, the Jewish community that remained in the Old City and which was pretty well off and owned a lot of workshops which employed many of the Palestinians in the Old City began to shut down, and many of them left. So according to many of the Palestinians, there were no jobs. Political and military Nidal was in the past. The overall economy in Syria was plagued with recession and high unemployment. There were no job opportunities for university graduates. The situation was beginning to be very bleak. Sami and a group of young women from the neighborhood who were active in the Palestinian women's groups and worked with UNRWA decided that there was a need for a center that would educate women. The focus on women was because they were the foundation of the family. Many women were unable to tutor their children at school, and many of them were illiterate or did not have the necessary qualifications to find employment. As military and political activities decreased, it became apparent that there had not been much focus by the Palestinian organizations and groups, the Tanzimat, on social aspects such as health and education in Hayy al-Amin. So a group of these women approached UNRWA to use a building that was under UNRWA's control to use as a center. Eventually, UNRWA agreed, and what is commonly referred to as Alliance, the Women's Program Center, staffed and administered by local women, opened in 1994. And according to the poster that you see when you first enter the center, it states that it is for social and economic development and self-reliance for the less fortunate individuals that live in the community of refugees, including women, children, youth, and individuals with mental and physical handicaps, to increase their participation and development in their community. To this end, the center is mainly a vocational training center. It includes a daycare, a preschool, and they also have tutoring session for students, especially those in Tawjihi or high school that need extra classes to help them pass their baccalaureate, their end of high school test. But what is interesting again is that we see a shift from Nidal that is focused on a wider Palestinian diasporic community to more about the local community of immediate social concerns and social needs. When I interviewed Samia in 2006 on subsequent visits, she insisted that the center was open for everyone. Although it was located in Hayy al-Amin, in an UNRWA building, staffed and run by Palestinians, she insisted that their services are for all people who live in the community, regardless of their affiliation, political, their sect, or anything at all. And I have to speed up. What is significant about the center is that it aims to empower the local community, although there are limited opportunities throughout the country as a whole. But it also wants to maintain a kind of cohesiveness among the remaining Palestinians in the old city and to maintain their sense of Palestinianness after political and military Nidal are over. As a matter of fact, one of the other forms of Nidal, in addition to social Nidal, is the religious Nidal that's becoming very common among the youth that live there. After Oslo, many setbacks were felt among the Palestinian community that lived in Syria. There is no clear presence or activities by the Palestinian organization. There also was a gap in solidarity between the Palestinian families in the old city. So the center comes at a time to reaffirm the Palestinianness of those who remain in the old city, but also to show that they are able to be productive members in their local community by opening a center that addresses local needs, demonstrating a certain degree of integration while maintaining distinction. And thank you.